So like I said, like unless you have specific questions about something on the exam, we're not going to bother going over it again, like no real need to. But I do want to point out that we are going to be going back to regular vocab quizzes this weekend, right? So this week's is going to cover the stuff from last week as well, right? So it'll include some stuff from A Christmas Carol, it'll include Sartor Resartus, and it will include also the Macaulay, Ingalls, and Chew stuff, right? So anything from those three sessions. And why did I leave? Why do I still have this on? I should turn this off now. Yes. I feel like I'm yelling. Why?
It was just for dramatic effect.
I guess, yeah. And yeah, we'll be finishing up the last three staves of A Christmas Carol for next time. I'll explain when we start discussing the text why these are called staves rather than chapters. Although if you know anything about music or music theory, you may already know why.
Is this like the stanzas that are supposed to be seen like as an actual Christmas carol?
Yeah, because it's a carol, it's music, right? So it's like staves of music, like you see in sheet music, yes. But before we get into Dickens, I do just want to bring a couple of things to your attention. First off, I am going to offer each of you a little bit of extra credit if you want to revise your paper for a better grade. So you can get up to 1 full letter grade's extra credit. Again, like not that really matters especially, but you can still get more points on the paper, right? If you revise the paper according to the feedback I give you and visit the writing center with it, or at least provide evidence that you tried. I'm very sorry that happened, Chloe.
It's okay.
We'll try to make sure that doesn't happen again. And it'll be due next Friday, the 14th. And this is totally optional. You don't have to do this, but if you want the extra points, this is available to you. Now, one thing that we do also have to discuss is what presentation topics each of you are going to take on. Like now, normally what I do is a kind of blind vote process where I have you write your student ID number on top of a sheet and have you rank in order of preference. But I figure, again, since there's only 3 of us and you all seem to get along with each other reasonably well, that you can probably just talk this out amongst yourselves at the beginning of class now, like if there are any topics that anyone is particularly interested in. So the first topic, which will also be the first presentation, a little under a month from now, will be on poetry in the First World War. So, we can talk about how to approach that depending on, who gets this and what they want to do. The second will be on changing perceptions of women in the 20th century. So the specific text for that will be Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own. But again, we can approach this in any number of different ways. And the third is going to be on immigration and assimilation in Britain in the latter half of the 20th century. And there are some poems and essays attached to that as well. So I'll let you 3 confer amongst yourselves about who wants what topic, and then we'll get into talking about Dickens.
I'm particularly interested in the First World War poetry.
Okay, I want to do the perceptions of women.
Okay, I'll take the last one. Sounds good to me.
Did anyone have any
Yeah.
stages of protest, concerns?
Okay, that was very quick and amicable, yes. Okay, so the first presentation, right, that'll be Ryland, right?
Yes.
And then Peyton, you will be doing the second presentation, and Kaylee, you will be doing the third. All right, so what I will do is over the weekend I'll put together an assignment sheet for this. Because I kind of want to redo the way I've been doing these. I'd like to give you a chance to kind of put your own sort of spin on it and maybe kind of use material from your own studies in a way that's, or from your own major, in a way that kind of we haven't done before. So like I know, if you're say majoring in visual arts, we might be able to do some kind of visual project, right? If you're majoring in nursing, then we might be able to focus on that aspect of, representations of the First World War in your presentation. And you're majoring in math, so I really don't know what we do, to incorporate that.
Statistics? I don't know.
I mean, yeah, maybe we could do something with statistics and have statistics relate to the poetry of the time. I mean, and this is the thing, right? Like, one thing that I want all of you to kind of grasp about literature is that it's kind of like it's one of the ways in art generally, right? This is kind of how human beings make sense out of all of these other discourses and like streams of information and random events in our lives, right? We construct art that helps us, if not to explain it, at least to survive through it, right? So, when you're majoring in something like English, it is often a good idea to know a lot about a lot of different things. And you can use the methods of just about any discipline to do English studies. And I'm just going to throw this out here, but given how well all of you are doing, like if any of you want to pick up a minor, we'd be happy to have you. I'm not joking.
I think I'm already about to add music as a minor, so I don't think I can do a double minor.
Honestly, if I could have multiple minors, I would. So.
I mean, there is a general studies program, which is basically just a bunch of minors.
Oh, cool.
But I think you're probably better off with one major and one minor on the whole. Okay, so let's then jump into the Dickens for today. So how many of you are at least a little bit familiar with this story? Okay, virtually everybody, right? Like at this point, like this is part of our cultural DNA. And in fact, like the way we celebrate the holiday of Christmas, the way we perceive and think about the holiday of Christmas has been largely shaped by Charles Dickens, right? Dickens doesn't out of whole cloth invent modern Christmas, but he has a big hand in kind of its shift from this multi-day celebration with kind of vaguely anti-authoritarian roots into this kind of like largely kind of like celebration of both commerce and family. So what we're probably going to talk about today as we look at the first two stanzas are the kind of specific circumstances of publication of this novella and the economic climate in which it appears and how some of that is represented in the early parts of the novella. Now, next time I want to talk a little bit about how A Christmas Carol kind of helps make that shift in the way people celebrate Christmas, at least in the Anglo-American world. But we'll kind of save most of that stuff for next time, I think, right? So before we really get into this, to what extent had any of you actually read this before? Okay, you had actually read it before, so this is not completely unfamiliar text to you, but you two hadn't. So I guess you've probably seen Christmas specials on TV or whatever, right? That tell the basic story. Like every sitcom, that lasts more than 2 or 3 seasons has at least one Christmas episode where the main character just can't get into the spirit of Christmas, and some 3 ghosts or wanderers or whatever have to show them the truth of things, or that sort of thing, right? So the basic narrative model has been copied endlessly, right? Was there anything about reading this that surprised you or that you didn't expect?
Not really.
No? Okay. I see you're looking for something, Kaylee.
There was one part, and I just hadn't remembered it, but it was when Marley's ghost was leaving.
Okay.
And it was talking like out the window, and like all of a sudden Scrooge could hear all the other ghosts, and he looks out and he sees like all of them, and it was basically that whole idea that like if you didn't do good in your lifetime, that you'd be doomed to wander and now see all the people you could no longer help. And like I didn't remember that from the first time. Like I remembered the chains,
Yeah.
and that was about it.
and that's often like, this is one of the scenes that's often cut out of like television or film adaptations of it, right? You know, in part maybe because like if you see like, you know, some of the old movies that still include this, it's freaking scary. You know, a bunch of ghosts flying around this kind of deserted neighborhood in London, right? You know, it's but yeah, I mean, but I think it is actually an important part of the story for some of the reasons you mentioned. So let's, can we actually just kind of go to that paragraph, kind of like starting on page 276, with the air was filled with phantoms. And Kaylee, since you pointed it out, can you read that for us, please?
Mm-hmm. Sure. It says the air is filled with phantoms. Sorry. Sorry. With phantoms wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many have been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost, in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery was with the misery with them all was, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever.
Okay, thank you. So, and we got this illustration here to match this, right? And what seems to you significant about this particular scene?
Scrooge knows the ghosts, some of the ghosts.
Okay, on the one hand, yeah, some of these people are actually his acquaintances, right? So he recognizes some of these individuals. What else might be significant about this?
I think it just shows like how short time really is, and like I think a lot of people just let time get away from them, but like once you're gone, like it's not like you can come back and do all these things for people anymore. So it's kind of like take a moment and stop and pause to notice the people around you.
Yeah, I think there's this kind of, I want to get back to the whole time thing, because that's actually really important here, the whole idea of time, right? So we'll come back to that in just a second. We'll stick a pin in that and come back to it in just a second. We also see here a kind of rigid separation between the material and the spiritual worlds, right? Why are these ghosts, who are now made up purely of spirit, right? They're mere phantoms. Why are they so upset? What can they no longer do?
Help people in any material way?
Yeah. They are unable to intervene in any way in the material world, right? So what's happened to their wealth?
It's gone. They don't have it anymore.
Well, actually, they do, don't they? Like in addition to the chains, right? The chains are kind of like weighted down with cash boxes, right? And this particular ghost is weighted down by a big iron safe. So they did take it with them, right? Yeah, that old adage that you can't take it with you, right, is here disproved, right? The problem is that if you take it with you, it stays with you, and not in a good way. So, one thing that the novella, I think, tries really hard to do is establish the reality of this spiritual realm of these ghosts, right? And I want to kind of look for a second at how and why it does this. Oh, but before we leave the whole time idea entirely, let's think back to before the exam. What was new in people's thinking about time in the Victorian period? How had our concept of time changed?
The time equals money. So about like the work day. Because you got paid by the hour. I think I actually wrote that somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And this whole idea that time, the time literally is money, right? It's not metaphorical. It's your time actually is worth something. It's a commodity that you can sell, and that an employer can buy from you, right? So this idea of time as something that can be bought, sold, and wasted, right? And that also can be organized into distinct units in a day, right? Farm workers typically didn't do that. You don't need to. You get up with the sun, you stop and eat when you get hungry, and then when the sun goes down, you go home and go to bed, right? Industrial workers, and for industrial workers in the cities, it's different. So we'll get back to this in a second, but let's deal with this whole spiritual thing first. So let's look. This is going to be a slightly roundabout way here, right? Now, what's the first paragraph of the Novella Tellus on page 264? What fact must be absolutely established?
That Marley was dead.
Yeah, that Marley is dead, right? Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. So, it must be established before anything else happens, where anything else takes place, that Marley is dead, right? Now, if we go down here a couple of paragraphs to the mention of Marley's funeral, can someone read that for us, please?
Where it says the mention of Marley's?
Yep.
I'll read it.
Thank you, Peyton.
The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turned out after dark in a breezy spot. Say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind.
So, okay, cool. So why the Hamlet comparison here? How many of you are familiar with Hamlet at all? Did you have to read Hamlet in high school, or no? None of you have read Hamlet?
I had to read Macbeth, but
Okay. Macbeth, I think Macbeth is actually arguably a better play in some respects, but that's neither here nor there. So, are any of you familiar with what the basic plot of Hamlet is? So the example here is largely lost on you. Okay. So Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark. His father has been murdered by his uncle, who was also then married Hamlet's mother to help solidify his claim on the crown. So Hamlet's father appears to him as a ghost to explain to him what happened and to get him to swear revenge. So, the first act of the first scene of Hamlet has other people see the ghost and try to talk to it before Hamlet's even aware of its existence. Basically just to establish the reality of the ghost, right? That the ghost is real. When Hamlet sees it, he's not crazy, he's not hallucinating, right? It does exist. Other people can verify it. And what this sets up here, right, is the notion that once we meet Marley's ghost, we are going to try to verify its existence, right? To demonstrate that this is real, that this must have happened. So, when Marley's ghost shows up, what do we notice about it? What does Scrooge claim it must be?
Oh, he thinks it's like an undigested bit of beef or a blot of mustard or something that upset his stomach and is all of a sudden making him hallucinate.
Yeah, he believes that this is a hallucination brought on by indigestion, right? So what does this tell us about Scrooge? And about Scrooge's basic kind of belief system and approach to the world?
He is super doubtful. Like he doesn't.
Okay, yeah, he's a skeptic, right? Yeah, Scrooge is a skeptic. And what else must he believe about, cause and effect if he assumes that Marley's ghost that he's seeing here right now must be the result of indigestion? What does this suggest with the way he thinks the material world and spiritual visions must be related?
Like that you're not supposed to be able to see anything of the spiritual world, like it must not maybe be there, or
Is it like
that it's-
kind of like tarot, where it's like
Yeah.
everything has a logical reasoning behind it?
Exactly, yes. If I'm seeing ghosts, right, there must be a logical material cause for it, right? So Scrooge lives entirely in the realm of the material. Right? He has no interest or belief in the spiritual, right? He doesn't think there can be ghosts, right? If there are ghosts, then it's because there's something wrong with him. Either, he's got indigestion or he swallowed a toothpick, right? Right? There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Now, how does Marley's ghost demonstrate to Scrooge its physical reality?
Can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Okay, so we've already noted, right, that the ghosts can't seem to affect the physical world, right? So how does Marley's ghost prove to Scrooge that it does have some kind of physical reality?
by sitting down in the chair?
Okay, it can sit in a chair, sure.
It says it sees the toothpick without looking at it.
Yes, but I see it nonetheless.
Yeah.
Right? What does it do in response to Scrooge's toothpick example.
That's when he like unwraps his head, right?
Yeah, he unwraps the bandage from around his head and the jaw drops onto his chest, right? Which, okay, like if you're sitting across from somebody, whether you think you're hallucinating them or not, and they do that, right? You are, I would imagine, likely to be terrified. I know I would be. But yeah, I mean, like, this demonstrates that, at least on its own plane, right? The spirit has some physical form or reality that is consistent, right? That the bandage it's wearing actually exists for some purpose. Right? To hold the dead man's jaw on. So because Scrooge is an absolute materialist, right? He needs this kind of evidence in order to believe in the spirits at all, right? He has to be convinced. Now, we're told actually, before we get to that, what's the question that Marley's ghost asks to Scrooge when Scrooge says that he doesn't believe in him?
Is it the part where he asks if, like, the pattern of the chain is strange to him and, like, talking about the weight and the length of it? And, like, if Scrooge knew that that was, like, the same weight that his chain would have been 7 years prior?
When he first asked if he believed, and he said no, and then Marley said, "Why do you doubt your senses?"
Why do you doubt your senses? Yes. And what are we told Scrooge is fighting against up near the top of the page? He fought against his senses, yeah. So what do we see Scrooge doesn't trust?
He doesn't trust himself at this point.
Yeah, he doesn't trust his senses, right? So even though he is a kind of absolute materialist, he doesn't trust the information he gets from his senses. Now, he is described on the first page of this as solitary as an oyster. Now, this may seem to be a strange simile, but think about it for a second. Because it actually works on a couple of levels here, right? In what ways might Scrooge be like an oyster?
He has a heart on the inside like a pearl, but he like shuts it away from everybody else.
Okay, yeah, so he's closed off, right? He's hoarding a treasure. And what else, what does an oyster not have that other animals do? Yeah, it doesn't have a face, it doesn't have hands, or it doesn't have eyes or a mouth, right? So what is it lacking then that's relevant to what we've just been talking about? Yeah, it doesn't have any, it has like a really rudimentary nervous system, right? But it doesn't have any sensory, sensory apparatus that would be familiar to us, right? External heat and cold, page 265, had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, nor wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he, No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have it. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. So, none of the, heat, cold, none of these sensory impressions that one would regard as uncomfortable affect him in the slightest, right? Now, when we pair this with what we know about his personality, and we think about this in terms of discourses we've been discussing earlier in the class, what does Scrooge lack?
Sensibility.
Yeah, he is completely devoid, apparently, of the ability to form sympathetic bonds with others through his senses, right? Just does not happen. And indeed, how much sense of individuality does Scrooge seem to have at the beginning? It's funny, right? Because he seems like, he's so, closed off and wrapped up in himself, right? But what are we told about him that seems strange for someone who seems so individualistic? I'll give you a hint, it's on page 264, next to last paragraph.
This is about his business with Marley, and how he was
Well, he never changed the name on the sign.
Yeah, he never painted Marley's name out on the sign, even though Marley's dead 7 years at the beginning of the story, right?
It says they knew the business called as Scrooge and sometimes Marley.
Yeah, he answered to both names, yeah. He doesn't care whether people call him Scrooge or Marley, right? He treats himself as interchangeable with his dead partner, or more specifically with the business, right? He identifies himself entirely with the business and not as a kind of separate human being, right?
Because he even asked Marley when he goes visit him about, but you were like an upstanding businessman, and Marley scoffs at that, what about
mankind should have been my business.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, well, and I think that's playing on these two senses of business, right? Business as a profit-making concern, right? As opposed to business as a kind of the way you behave in the world, right? Now, do we see a figure in the novella so far who maybe kind of brings these two concerns together? Who runs a profit-making business while also giving a shit about other people?
Are the two gentlemen that visit Scrooge?
Okay, we don't really know too much about their background. I want to talk to them about it. But yeah, I think that would be one example, right? But there's another more specific one that I'm thinking of.
It was like the guy Scrooge worked for, but I can't remember exactly what his
Yeah.
Oh, Fezzy.
Yeah, it was like Fizzy.
Yeah, Fezziwig, who has the Christmas party, right? Who seems to be modeled here as, really kind of like, the best possible boss, right? Right, he's kind to his employees, he throws them an annual Christmas party, and, not only does he invite those who work for the company and those who are part of his own household to the party, he also invites others in the neighborhood whom he suspects are being ill-treated, right? And, you know, we're told on page 285 here, right? A small matter, said the ghost, to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. Small, echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the two apprentices, who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said, "Why, is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" So 3 or 4 pounds in 1840 would have been about $500 to $700. So for a company Christmas party, right? This isn't that much, right? This is chump change. But the amount, as Scrooge correctly notes, is disproportionate to just like, you know, the joy it brings just by showing, you know, a little bit of caring to the people around you. Isn't that, said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. It isn't that, spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count him up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. So, what does Fezziwig do as a boss that Scrooge does not?
He brings happiness.
Okay. Scrooge doesn't seem to bring happiness anywhere he goes, right? No one is ever happy to see this guy.
I think also even like with Fezziwig, like he could be encouraging to people even just with his words, like even if it wasn't like with something material, and like Scrooge doesn't even give that to other people.
Yeah.
He's just grumpy and I mean, and
doesn't talk to other people who doesn't have to, right?
and talking about how basically like his worker was like picking his pocket for having Christmas off and still getting paid, and you're like, how completely ungenerous can someone be?
A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every December the 25th. Yes, it's yeah, but no, I mean, it's yeah, like all, and I think that's kind of related to this, right? The idea that when your worker is not like, when you think your worker ought to be on the clock, that he's doing something else, right? That he is wasting your time and thus wasting your money, right? But the money Fezziwig spends is not money wasted, I think is part of the point that Scrooge is trying to make as he connects with his younger self here, right? That, yeah, is this time when, you know, people in the company could be working? Sure, right? They're probably arguably still on the clock. But what's happening here is actually, from Dickens' perspective, more economically productive than what you would get if you know, Fezziwig just forced Ebenezer and Dick to keep grinding away for another couple hours, right? And let me explain a little bit of the context here, and I think this will help help us with what's going on with the economics of this, right? So, this book was first written during an economic depression, right? So what's called the Depression of 1840, or the Hungry 40s, right? This is actually a multi-year depression. So in 1839, Actually, started a little earlier. In 1837, a number of European countries use a lot of money when their investments in the United States. Specifically, they had loaned money to specific states. Those investments fail because the states can't pay back the money. So this causes in Britain, in 1839, a huge trade slump. Coupled with several years of bad harvests. In Ireland in particular, the potato crop fails for several years in the 1840s. And Ireland is economically dependent upon the potato crop. You also have a rapidly increasing population. Especially in and around the cities, as we already discussed. So the government tries to deal with this mostly through what are called austerity measures. Do y'all know what that means in economics when a government puts itself on austerity measures? Nobody? Okay, yeah, this was actually in the years after the kind of housing market crashed in 2008 and took the global economy with it. A lot of governments tried this same thing, right? So basically what austerity means is that the government is cutting back aggressively on spending, right? So instead of pumping more money into the economy to try to get it going, which we know from recent experience can cause inflation, right? If there's too much money floating around in the economy, it causes prices to go up. Austerity, taken to an extreme, causes the opposite problem, right? Basically, it means there's not enough money in the economy, so you end up with scarcity, with people unable to afford necessities. And so, supply starts outstripping demand. You've got too much that people aren't buying. And because there were tariffs on imported grain, basic dietary staples like bread became extremely expensive. So this is the basic economic environment that Dickens is publishing this novella in, right? Now, it's published as a gift book. So it's the same sort of book as those literary annuals that we talked about, right? So what do we remember about those literary annuals that stories like The Mortal and the Myrtle appeared in?
They were really decorative, and oftentimes the art on the inside was more important than necessarily the stories themselves.
Yeah, and the original illustrations are reproduced here in our anthology, right? So there were several illustrations. It was a beautifully produced product, right? And Dickens was hoping to move more copies by offering it for a lower price than was typical for a Christmas gift book, right? So most gift books would have gone for about 8 shillings, or like, kind of roughly maybe like $50, right? A Christmas Carol in its first edition sold for 5 shillings, which was the equivalent of about $33. So, not an insignificant cost, but also well within the means of a relatively well-off middle-class family, right? So that tells us something also about who this is aimed at, right? Is this particular, is the intended audience for this the rich or the poor? Yeah, he's shooting right for the middle, right? And a lot of what he is trying to do here is encourage that middle class to open up their purses and start spending money. Whether it's on charity for those less fortunate, whether it's just on stuff to sort of keep the economy moving, right? A big part of the message here is that people need to spend in order for society to, in order for a capitalist society to function, right? If people like these misers with their iron safes kind of stored in the spiritual world, and people like Scrooge don't start spending their damn money, right? Then things are going to be stuck like this for a lot longer. And yeah, go ahead, Rob.
I figured that Dickens was putting some of his political views in it.
Oh, sure.
Especially in, like when he was seeing that the scene that you were talking about when you were seeing out the window. And he mentioned it must have been corrupt. They might be guilty governments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The guys who are chained together, yeah. Corrupt or guilty governments, yeah.
I think he was definitely putting his own things in that, even in that scene.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I think like Dickens's reputation among readers is typically as somebody who kind of champions the poor and the lower middle classes, which is one of the reasons why he doesn't really enter the high literary canon until relatively late in the 20th century, right? He was regarded as a popular writer rather than an artist for a long time. And I think some of that is kind of his sympathy with the poor. Maybe a sticking point for some people. It sometimes does actually get a little bit strident and sometimes a little bit mawkish and overly sentimental. I'll be honest, Tiny Tim often makes me roll my eyes a little bit. But so where was I about to go with this?
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It was a good observation. And I'd rather you make a good observation and stop me when I'm on a roll than you sit there and just kind of listen while my words wash over you, right? No, that's so. The other contextual thing that I want, and we've got a good bit of contextual stuff here, right? The kind of the focus on time. We've got the return of this sensibility discourse, the economic issues in the period. The other context that I want us to be thinking about here is the work of a late 18th century economist by the name of Thomas Malthus. Have any of you ever heard this name before? The
Is that the one that was in the footnote? Okay.
Yes, okay. Yes, he is in the footnote.
I was like, I do think of him.
Have any of you ever heard this name before outside of the footnotes for this novella? Okay, so Malthus is hugely influential, particularly in Whig and liberal governments of the early 19th century, right? So again, remember that liberal in the British 19th century sense doesn't mean the same thing that we mean by it, right? The liberals were very much the pro-business party. Think people like Macaulay. So when these two portly gentlemen arrive on page 267, can I get somebody to start reading from "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge"?
I will.
Thank you, Riley.
Okay. At this festive season of the year, Mrs. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir. Are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the union workhouses? Demanded Scrooge. Are they still in operation? They are still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then, said Scrooge. Both very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it.
Okay, so we can pause here for a second,
Okay.
right? So does everybody know what he means when he's talking about the workhouses and the treadmill?
According to Pluto, that
Yeah, right.
prisoners during that time were made to run on a mill, run on a mill, like keep the mill pumping.
Yeah, which was actually less efficient than just having like a horse or a mule
Right.
drive the mill or a machine. And in these workhouses, right, this, where people who couldn't afford their own keep were sent usually to do some kind of relatively pointless task, right? So one of the most common tasks in the workhouse was, it was called oakum picking. So they would sit you down at a table with a bunch of other people, and they'd give you these lengths of rope, and you were supposed to pick all the tar off of the rope. And the tar was then supposed to be recycled for use in shipbuilding. Now, you could not actually get enough oakum out of a rope to actually create a useful quantity, right? So this was just like pointless bullshit busy work that people were put through because, their social superiors believed that they were poor because they were idle. And that the best thing you could do for the poor was put them to some sort of task, even if it was a stupid, pointless, and inefficient task. It's kind of interesting, like there's a book by an anthropologist named David Graeber that I kind of recommend to everybody, particularly to college students, because it illustrates some traps I don't want you to fall into. The book is called Bullshit Jobs, and it basically argues that these kinds of pointless jobs, like jobs that have no real reason to exist, like oakum picking or running on the treadmill, are actually now primarily in the college-educated white-collar sector. So if you have a job that pays well, but has a relatively fancy title, pays well, requires a BA or a BS, and has some kind of fancy title attached to it, but you can't really figure out what it is you're supposed to be doing, you probably have a bullshit job, according to Graeber's definition, right?
What did you say this guy's name is? Oh, woman's name is?
This author?
Yeah, it's
His
his
name's
author.
David Graeber. But yeah, so the bullshit jobs in the Victorian period are by and large these workhouse jobs, right? This is work that no one actually needs to be doing, but that people are being forced to do for a kind of bare minimum sustenance. Because people think it's immoral for anyone not to work, right? Now, what does this suggest about how Scrooge believes the poor should be cared for? He wants to, are the prisons still open? Are the union workhouses and the treadmill, are they still in effect, right? Is the poor law still in operation? Who does Scrooge think should be responsible for the poor? Yeah, that it's a problem for the state to deal with, right? Not him. right? I pay my taxes, damn it. Where does that money go? So yeah, so Scrooge believes the state should be dealing with this problem. Right? Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing, Scrooge replied. You wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, then they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that. But you might know it, observed the gentleman. It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. So this refers us directly back to that conversation with Marley we mentioned earlier, right? Mankind should have been my business. Whereas Scrooge is entirely wrapped up in the profit-making definition of business. But this also kind of takes us to this very popular, at least in government circles, ideology of the early 19th century. Right? So Malthus wrote a book in 1798, which, like most nonfiction books of the 18th century, has a very, very long title called Essay on the Principle of Population. And Malthus's basic argument was that while food resources over time increase arithmetically, right, that is kind of by addition, population increases geometrically, that is by multiplication.
I have heard of this guy.
Okay.
Sociology.
Okay, good. So like he is, like, in addition to being a kind of early economist, he is also an early sociologist. Yeah. So what this means effectively is that your population is always going to grow faster than the resources to feed that population, which will be okay for a couple of generations, but then you're going to run out of food. Now, the basic problem with Malthus's philosophy, or at least the basic problem that I have with it, is that his solution to this is basically just to let nature take its course. Right? He does not approve of any measures that one could take to slow population growth. The introduction of things like later marriage, or birth control, right? Encouraging smaller families, right? Because he believes those things would lead to vice and immorality. So what he proposes instead is that, well, the poor don't necessarily deserve to eat. So let those who cannot afford their sustenance starve.
Okay.
And those who cannot afford their sustenance, right? That's what Malthus refers to as the surplus population. So this phrase that Scrooge uses is taken directly from Malthus's essay. And Dickens is attempting here, throughout the course of the novella, to argue against Malthus's point of view, right, that we should just mind our own business and let the poor do whatever, right? Dickens instead is he's not necessarily arguing from what we would today call like a kind of leftist economic perspective. It's not a socialist perspective. He's not arguing for higher taxes on the rich that are then redistributed throughout the population, right? He's not necessarily arguing about the role of state in any of this at all. What he is arguing for is generosity and private charity, right? Which I think is where one place where we can draw this connection between economics and sensibility, right? Sensibility was supposed to encourage benevolence. It was supposed to encourage you to think kindly towards your fellow beings. If you could sense what they were going through, right? If you could imagine what you would feel like yourself if you were experiencing these same things, then you would feel more inclined to assist your fellow humans, right? And I think we can see some examples of this taking place if we look at Scrooge's adventure with the Ghost of Christmas Past, right? And this is probably, we're running close to the end of class here, so we'll probably kind of finish with this little episode here. If we look in the bottom of page 281, can somebody just read that last very, very short paragraph for us at the bottom of the page?
Which one?
The very bottom of the page starts with, then with the rapidity of transition.
I can. Then with the rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cap. "But it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge. "Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, and that's all."
Okay, thank you, Paige. So we'll stop there. So what's the point of this little episode here? What's the first thing Scrooge has to feel sympathy for?
Himself.
Yeah. He has to feel something for himself, right? Before he can feel any kind of sympathy with other people. And then once he's able to feel some sort of pity for his past self, right? This poor, lonely boy left in a cold schoolroom over the Christmas holiday while everybody else goes home. He is then able to transfer that sympathy to another human object, right? To the boy who he chased away from the door for singing Christmas carols earlier, right? It's like, I should have been nicer to that poor little kid, right? I shouldn't have, hurled him back out into the snow. But yeah, I think this seems to be like the process that this Ghost of Christmas Past is putting him through. It's kind of like putting him back in touch with his former self before he became entirely self-enclosed, right? So on the one hand, we are seeing the process by which a Scrooge is made, but Scrooge is also learning to feel for others by examining his own past experiences, right? So I think it's clear here that the method being employed here is, one of sensibility, broadly speaking. And I said that was going to be the last thing, but I think there is one more thing that I just want to touch on before we go, because this is going to lead into some stuff we're going to talk about next time. So let's look on page 279 at the physical description of the Ghost of Christmas Past. So can somebody read those two paragraphs at the top of 279 for us?
I can.
Thank you.
It says, "It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound its lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, it had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its stiller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and now in another, and what was light one instant at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away, and in this the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever."
Thank you. So, again, I can never remember what I've told one class and what I've not told another. Have we gone over before the concept of allegory? Okay, that's not ringing a bell? Okay, and none of you know what an allegory is, independent of this class.
You probably would if you wouldn't have asked.
The moment I put you on the spot, that's when it falls right out of your memory, right? Okay, so an allegory is essentially going to look like an image or story that works on two or more levels of meaning. So on the one hand, right, there is a literal meaning, right, in the narrative. So, here, we have this description of the ghost as this thing that Scrooge is literally experiencing, right? But an allegory also has a kind of intentional symbolic meaning that points to something outside the text. So, for example, a historical allegory might give you a set of, might symbolize, a certain sequence of events or a particular historical figure, right? An allegory of ideas is going to be a kind of physical manifestation or physical representation of some idea or other, right? And so what we have here in the figure of the Ghost of Christmas Past is an allegory of ideas. And since we started early, we're about out of time right now. So what I want you to do is think on this for next time. What ideas might the physical representation of each of the three ghosts represent, right? And this will kind of link us up with what we're going to do next time. All right, so let me give you the other guide questions. And then off and, well, I guess not quite enjoy your weekend because it's only Wednesday.